what's your sense of how the cultural context or the messages that are coming to women, how those have changed over the decades or how those have stayed the same, those sort of external or cultural messages?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately some of them haven't changed. You know, you should be a mother. Every woman should want to be a mother. Every woman should want to be a homemaker, taking care of because she's naturally more nurturing. You know, those messages are still there. The but yeah, that's still there. Has it changed? There is a concomitant. You should work. You should want, especially for white women, you should want to achieve. You should want, and for many African American women, you should want to be a credit to your race. You should want, for Latino women in a very traditional Hispanic environment, you should want to be uh, a aspire to be taking care of the house, taking care of your family. You should want to do that. You should want to marry somebody who is going to provide for you. So it hasn't changed all that much. Although there's more freedom, but it hasn't changed all that much.
So I want to hit on, and if you don't mind, I'm going to quote you a little bit. Um, so in 2023, you had a paper published in the Counseling Psychologist. Yeah, several, but it's one systematic review, and I'm just going to quote you because I want you to sort of, I think well, it's well written and it's also worth commenting on. So you wrote exploration of internal and external conflicts between the demands of work and family continue to be a significant factor in women's career development. And then a few lines later, often clients' internal and external conflicts interact in self-shaming thoughts and excessive guilt related to balancing these roles. And end quote. And when I read that in my own anecdotal experience, that's what I see in here. Like I see that as an experience that I guess particularly white women often have, that it's not it's not like this the balance scales where like one has gone down and the other has gone up, that there is this kind of, they've both gone up, and the amount, and to be frank, I think that I'm mostly naive of that. Like, oh wow, that, like, and then I hear it and I'm like, oh wow, that's hard. Like that's a hard way to live. And to me, it can be not as a therapist, but as sort of, someone who cares about, it's like, it feels like, don't feel that way. Obviously, it's not that simple, but that's my reaction. Is it's sort of like, oh, why do like, why do you put all this pressure on yourself to do this and do, it's okay, but that, so I was just,
And how's that work for you?
oh yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, so so what's your question?
Well, I guess could you speak to, well, I guess I sort of think that you were about to go with something. So I kind of want to let you just sort of riff and then I'll come back with specific questions if there
Okay.
are any.
Uh, First of all, it's hard to get access. It is self-shaming, and it's hard to get access to what the messages are so pervasive. Pervasive. It comes from media. I'm not so on social media at all, and I'll tell you what my experience was that led me not to do that. But uh, 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 the it comes from social media. It comes from YouTube videos. Is that also called social media? Anyway, it comes from family. It comes from books. It comes from, think about my uh 10-year-old granddaughter. Um, she's exposed to all of those fairy tales. You meet the man, you meet the prince, he takes care of you. She also has other messages, and she certainly has messages from her mother who has a PhD, and et cetera, et cetera. But and her grandmother who has a PhD, right? But the messages are so pervasive about what your goals should be. And in America, I don't know if this is true in Canada, but in the US, it is very, the question that kids get, if an adult doesn't know what to say to a kid, they say, what do you want to be when you grow up? At age 4, right? And from a career development perspective, what kids are going to say is what the uniform is, or what all of the external uh, accoutrements of a career. They want the police uniform, the firefighter uniform, the ballerina slippers, the tutu, those kinds of very traditional things, right? And that gets gendered from the minute these kids are born. I mean, literally from the minute these kids are born. And the messages about what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what your values should be, what paths you should take are so pervasive that you don't even know you're feeling crummy about not following a path that you didn't realize you had set yourself on. And it's so thinking of Bronfenbrenner's multiple layers, you get the messages about your gender, you get the messages about your race, you get the messages about your schooling, your social class, you get the messages about from the politics now, very, very divisive politics in the United States. And then before you know it, it's hard to unpack all of that, and you've made decisions, and that's really, if I could do anything, would be to get kids to eliminate those barriers in high school, so when they're ready to make a decision, they're free to make the decision. They haven't, if you don't take math in high school, you want to be an engineer, you've got at least 3 years of remedial work before you can even think about what you want to do. So think about the barrier of that, much less if you want to aspire to be a physician or a scientist, or, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that I'm answering your question, Dan, am I?
So if you were to speak to the therapist or the therapist in training about how they could work with women experiencing this conflict.
Well, the first thing would be to help women realize that there are external barriers, So this work I did, if I can pivot a little bit to this research I did, I had a student, Mary Fitzpatrick, who was an engineer. She had a bachelor's and a master's in engineering, and decided to come back and get a PhD in counseling psych to really study women in engineering. And we were she was on my research team doing a lot of this research on barriers for girls at middle school, high school, and college. And we were finding some interesting differences, but still seeing those gender differences, particularly in math. Although one interesting thing is everybody lumps math and science together. The kids themselves see them as very different. But Mary said to me, we don't want to do another project. I was getting my team to think of another project we could start. She said, let's not ask why women go, what they choose to do. Why are women going into engineering and then not staying in engineering? And she had a lot of friends, colleagues over the years that did that, and it's roughly half of the women who graduate in engineering, enter the field, graduate in a very difficult curriculum, enter the field, and then they don't stay in the field. And so that really set us on a project with my colleague here in the business school, Romala Singh, which was a marvelous project. And we ended up going to universities and getting their alumni list. So these were women who graduated in engineering, and then we followed up with them. And then because you know I don't know what, about 500 of the 5,000 that we ended up getting had left the field, and we were, and they were leaving the field for chilly climate. They were leaving the field for sexism, racism, sexual harassment, and blaming themselves. So if I could say to anything to a therapist, it's like really helping women to realize these are external barriers. They do not need to take sexual harassment. So often women think this is my fault. I must have done something, and the whole culture is geared around blaming them for this. So helping women to understand that there are external barriers and then there are internal barriers, and those internal barriers are the messages they tell themselves. I'm not good enough. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'll be a good enough mother. I don't know if I'll be a good enough partner. And then if they're in a non-traditional field, they may not have the kinds of resources that they need to be successful in that occupation.
So what do we do?
Well, I do think, from a social cognitive perspective, we empower them, we help them learn political skills, we help them describe the situation, and help them perhaps have a different lens on it, particularly if they're seeing it as an internal fault when it's really an external situation. Can they get? I mean, we know from the research that mentoring helps, that learning political skills helps, that helping them to uh, own their voice at work helps. Those are the kinds of things that they can facilitate women doing, and helping them to reframe the problem. Can I give an example? So there was, and in this study, we, we were hoping for 800 women in engineering to respond, and we ended up well over 5,000 women. It was incredible. It lit a fuse for people. And I'm still getting emails from people writing and saying, um, I was in your study in 2012, and yeah, that kind of thing. But one woman wrote, so we put a text box in, anything else you want us to know? And it was like thousands of pages of comments. One woman wrote and said she was the last person. Her manager insisted, or supervisor insisted on speaking to every single member of the department before they individually could go home. Not everybody as a whole could go home, but they individually could go home. And because she was a single woman, she was always the last one that he talked to. The only woman in the department. She was the only one, the last one he talked to. And she said, but I don't know that I can do anything because all the rest of them have to go home to a family. Well, okay, what do you do with that as a therapist? No, he should be evaluated for how he's treating her differently. And how do you role model? How do you empower her to go have that conversation? And if he doesn't change, how do you empower her to go have the conversation with his boss? That's an example.
So could I ask you to like dig into that a little bit in terms of like, if I'm working, imagine if you were talking to a student on practicum, and
Mhm.
how would you help them teach, well, I guess one, to believe that she should have that conversation, but maybe even more to the point, because this is more unique, I think, is how would you walk them through how to teach her to have that conversation effectively?
Well, it's a good question because I do this all the time with students, right? So asking, so what does she want to have? I would want the counselor to empower the client to choose her own goals, first of all. So I'm not going to impose that on her, but I am gonna. There is some consciousness raising that I think needs to happen here. That she doesn't have to put up with this. You know, if she doesn't change, if she doesn't change the situation, how likely is she to leave? Does she want to leave? What would she want to, um, how would she want to resolve it, with the realization that the angrier you get, the less productive a conversation is, right? And I also really believe in earlier discussions are better. So the earlier she can have that conversation with him, that, maybe he doesn't even realize it, but the consequence is that she's working every night until 10 o'clock, and sometimes doesn't, and feels like it's very unfair, and feels like she's being treated very differently. And I will bet you that there are policies in her organization that work against that. So I would also encourage her to know what the policies are, to know what her rights are, so that she can be informed on the decision that she wants to make. So walking through that with her, and the consequence of not doing anything as well.
I think that part of, when you were talking earlier about how to help women in some of these situations, part of what I was hearing was kind of a very, I mean, whatever your orientation happens to be, but a very, an obvious application of a very cognitive model, right? Like, so, what are these what are you telling yourself? What's reasonable? What's rational? That sort of stuff. But then when you jumped into talking about, learning political skills, which is sort of what we're talking about here, I was like, that is something that we don't teach very much in our classes or shows up very often in our textbooks, is how do you help a client
Right, learn those
learn?
skills.
Yeah, and so that really
Right.
sort of stood out to me as like, that is a unique thing that would be helpful for practitioners in terms of when they're working with clients.
Yeah, so I would say, as a therapist, I'm much more emotional, much more get to the emotions, because most of the clients I've worked with over the years have been too much in their head to get to for me to really do good work just cognitively, so more emotional in terms of how do you want this to go, and how's this feeling for you, and how is it working for you, and so on and so forth. But also from a social cognitive perspective, from the career theory of social cognitive perspective, I also would approach it from how do you increase self-efficacy, and how can you have some successful experiences? How can you decrease your anxiety? These are sources of self-efficacy, and also start to look at realistic outcome expectations.
So I had a conversation, I don't know, about a month ago, did an episode with Jesse Owen from the University of Denver, and he really helped me clarify my thinking when it comes to social justice and what he proposed, or he sort of argues that we should be doing in the therapy room. And so I don't want to speak for him, but my sort of interpretation of what I learned in that was that he pushes, he's a big fan of social justice approaches and theories and practices. And when he's working one-on-one with a client, that he's focused on the client and what's going to be most beneficial for them, rather than
His
focusing
role.
on changing the system. Like, those
Yeah.
two things are pretty separate. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and what, if you could speak to that a little bit, and you're thinking about working with women.
Well, I think it's a good question, because there's always, um, so you remember my talking about the zeitgeist and the environment. Certainly, feminist therapy came out of that zeitgeist in the early '80s, and Laura Brown's uh, writing about feminist therapy and the personal is political, right? And the notion that we owe. I'm not an adherent to this, but the notion that we owe our clients the challenges of the challenge of a feminist perspective, that they should understand the power dynamics involved in the shaming, as the self-shaming that you talked about. I have a hard time, um, I guess I would say I have a hard time not doing that without informed consent. And but I haven't done therapy personally for a long time, so I'm just talking about what I'm doing, talking about with supervision of the client work my students do. But I would have a hard time doing that without informed consent, but I think I still need to raise the question that what are the power dynamics here? And what do you want? Raising the question doesn't impose the value on them. Um, but it's, I have students who are in large mental health systems, how do you not question that's a social justice perspective for me. The role of insurance, the role of the management of these companies for the gain and not for the good. I won't say much more than that.
Well, and I think, and what I heard you saying, which makes sense, is so if you're working in that large system, then what you push for, what your attention might be in that system would fall under a sort of a social justice framework, where at least what I heard you saying is, if you were working with a client or you were working with someone working with a client, that the consciousness raising or awareness of power dynamics, I still hear that as that's still in service of the client.
Well, I think absolutely. And I struggle, um, I struggle from a feminist perspective to be aware of that, but it's not my decision. It's not my life, So I think that you could do more harm than good if you're imposing a, you know, if you're imposing this perspective on clients that they're not ready to hear. If you're raising questions, is one thing. It's imposing. Do you realize this is a power dynamic here? I just don't think I don't think it's ethical to do that.
So how would you handle it instead?
Well, I think raising the question, is it possible, there are potentially power dynamics here. Is it possible that that's what's going on? And I have had the experience where a student has resisted looking at it that way and then circled back and said, oh, maybe, maybe. So I think that my role is to raise the question. I don't do anybody any good if I don't raise the question. If I think that that may be there, it may be an insight that is valuable to the client, and they can choose to disregard it if they want.
So, trying to think about where I want to go next. I think it's an interesting, um, it's like the question of, is this a sort of gendered power dynamic, or is this something different? I often sort of, say, is this a manifestation of sexism, or is this person just kind of a jerk? And
Yeah,
like how to,
but
um,
but so to go back to that article, and one of the things we found in that article, in that review, uh, the the systematic external barriers are still so pervasive for women, right? So the question, I think, is this an external barrier, or are you internalizing something that to your detriment? And I still think that's a relevant question. Now, um, I mean, women can be jerks too, right? But but I still think it's if you start to question the decisions that, I mean, so many of these decisions are human made, right? If you question the decisions, like, who says you only get six sessions? Who says, right? And what if you need more? Who says I can only have six sessions with this client, right? And why was that decision made? And what if the client needs more? I'm digressing a little bit here, but what is um, so many of these decisions are made from external factors that have very little to do with the mental health of the client. And I still think helping a client to view the appropriate role of external constraints is valuable.
Yeah, and I love what you just said, and I know that you talk about this in your work, but that it's such a simple framing. Is this something like is this internalized? Is this something I'm telling myself, or I'm sort of, and that could be an internalization of something external, but is this something I'm telling myself that's getting in my own way of living the life I want to live? Or is this an external barrier and I'm going to deal with those things somewhat differently?
Yeah, right. And I do think that I'm going to go back to something I said earlier. I think you still have to ask about the consequences of bucking some of those messages. And so what are that in that story I was talking to, I gave of the woman and the supervisor, are there consequences to her challenging him? And what are the talking through, role modeling, empty chair technique, and so on and so forth, talking through what might be the consequences of this and how would she handle that? That's just good therapy, right?
So at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about the work that you did in that school and how effective it was. So what I heard, one of the things I took away from that is that we can do things to help open up women's perspectives in terms of potential careers, potential occupations that they could go into, things they would like, things they would be successful in. Are we doing that? And let's sort of keep it to the US where you have your expertise. Are we doing that overall? Is that part of the system now? And I know it varies, right?
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, I did a study with Angela Byers Winston, who's now at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we looked at the census. So remember I talked about women entering the workforce in the late 70s, early 80s. So we looked at 1970, 1980, when you're starting to get affirmative action policies, EEO policies, so we looked at the census 70, 80, 90, 2000, and 2010. And if you looked at the policies, and external policies, the billions of dollars that have gone into federal grants, foundation grants on helping girls go into STEM careers. If you looked at all of that and EEO and affirmative action, you should have seen that influx of women and racial ethnic minorities into the workforce. You should have seen a better distribution of across occupations. We still saw in 2015 the same occupational segregation we saw in 1970. So it's pretty depressing. There's some combination of external factors and internal factors that go into why this occupational segregation is so pervasive. What, I don't know. I mean, here I'm ending my career and saying the same thing. It's so pervasive.
I had naively assumed that it had gotten better. I'm not saying that it was perfect, but I had assumed it had moved a couple of points.
Well, I think where it's moved a couple points is in education. We are seeing more, but the 20% of college engineering graduates are women. Okay, that's been the case since 1990. And half of them leaving engineering. That's still the case since 1990 or 90s, So there needs to be more systemically done. Yeah. And the current in the US, the current backlash against DEI initiatives doesn't help, because some of the things we know that do help have to be systemic. They have to be systemic. Yeah.
Right. And that's sort of what I would think a lot of the programs that have been developed and evaluated over the years, that those would be integrated into the education system.
Yeah. And it's not that we don't know some things. For example, here's a policy. For example, there's the American School Counseling Association has a marvelous set of standards and ways that kids in the United States should have career development programming, as well as academic programming, social emotional programming. It's a very, very good model, mandated by many states, almost none of which mandate a school counselor do it. So in Wisconsin, for example, there is a mandated school counseling program, but it doesn't have to be delivered by a qualified school counselor. And we know what the best ratios are, and student to counselor ratios, right? In schools, very few states actually have that. So that's an example where if you really wanted to move the needle, that's where the money needs to go. And it did in the 60s. The Sputnik focused a lot of money and resources into schools to increase science education that both girls and boys benefited from, right? The National Defense Education Act. And then that money gets, sort of the original career education materials came from. So we know what works. We just costs money, and there's less and less incentive to do that preventive kind of work.
So what's pushback that you've gotten to your work?
Well, I would say the biggest pushback I've gotten has been around the engineering work, where we were. I mean, the first pushback came, why didn't we study men? Why would, and my answer to that was it wasn't about the men. We were really interested in what was the experience for women. And in that we had 4 revisions. Never mind, I won't say that, but we got pushback on that article that was published in TCP, in the Counseling Psychologist, because we just focused on within group differences for women. And people kept saying, yeah, but what about the men? And it's like, I don't care about the men. I mean, I am married to a wonderful man. I have 3 sons. I care about men specifically. But in this research question, I really wanted to know what the differences were for women. And what did we need to know about the experiences for women, as not as compared to men, but what their experiences were for women. And then in the engineering study, because we really did conclude that it was the climate. It was a climate. So one of the articles I think one of the presentations we gave, it was titled, "It's a Climate, Stupid." It's the climate that was really making women leave engineering, not workforce. I mean, most of these women were working in big companies that had the policies in place, but we were concluding that it was the climate. And the pushback there was, no, it's not the climate, it's because they want to have babies. It's like, no, that's not what our research is showing. But it was like, I started to go, be asked to talk to various companies and stuff, and I wouldn't go unless I had an opportunity to really speak to decision makers. And regardless of the level that I was talking to, the CEO or the CIO or CTO or whatever their title was, they'd say, yeah, but they really just, they just need to work harder. No, if you want to keep women, you need to make the environment different, Well, how do I do that? Well, pay attention, pay attention to who's, if you have policies, who's taking advantage of them. What's going, the manager, the frontline supervisor was so critically important. And that was the person that was not having the most interventions, the ways to intervene for them. Nobody paying attention to what they were doing. We followed up, got money to do, this was too bad, but we got a grant to look at teams and what predicted an effective team that led to innovation. And that study totally got derailed by COVID. We had companies that were willing to work with us, and then, you're just not going to study. They didn't want to study teams during COVID, and then they didn't want to study teams where half of them were remote, and it just was, yeah. So it totally derailed that project. It's too bad because it was a good study.
So if you were talking to a clinician who was working, let's just, for example here, who was working with a mom, and mom is stressed out because she's having this, I want my daughter to have, I see my daughter's good at math, likes math, or whatever. It doesn't even have to be that. But she's worried, she wants to open up opportunities for her daughter who's 10, who's 12. And this is something that mom's thinking about a lot because she's reflecting on what her experiences were and her perception of herself. And even, in our little example here, mom is actually quite good at math, but she went into, I don't know, whatever she went into, it has nothing to do with math in our little example. And so what would you encourage? How would you help that clinician, that helper work with mom so that she could open up the doors for her daughter, the perception or perspective of her daughter?
I would get her involved in any extracurricular activities that support math and science. Summer programs, museum programs, get her involved, take her to, um, uh, you know, Washington DC and go to the national, the National Space and Air Museum, Air and Space Museum. I would take her to Kansas City and go to the space thing there, whatever that thing, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I would just expose her to as much opportunities to learn as possible. I would, so again, this is thinking about what are the opportunities to learning experiences. What are the opportunities to get role modeling? Where are the role models in the community or YouTube or whatever that would be? I would try to assess if there's anxiety that needs to be reduced, test anxiety or, something like that. Now we're talking physiological arousal. And I would give her all the opportunities to pursue those learning experiences.
So really it's how can I help her be exposed to these? And I need to think creatively about what's in my community, what's in my budget, what's possible to
Right,
get her into these situations.
exactly. And then listen for what might be, so now I'm talking about increasing self-efficacy and increasing realistic outcome expectations. So what could you do with this? What would be, an opportunity to, if you're studying whales, who studies whales? If you like dinosaurs, who studies dinosaurs? So you're linking the interests to the career as well.
Great. Well, Dr. Fouad, I really appreciate your time. This has been
Yeah.
fantastic.